The following audio is via a Skype call.
Welcome to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Get ready to find your free will from your roots in the stars.
Hi, Sue Rose Minahan. Today is Libra as far as our archetypal conversation continues, and it is date-wise October 6th, a Saturday, 2018. I happen to be in Tucson, and I happen to be involved with the astrology conference. And I have a wonderful guest that is returning, who spoke during July, Laura Tad, a Ph.D. And Laura's link, if anybody, for you that are wanting to connect with her, is Mythic Sky. She's a psychological astrologer. She speaks internationally. Laura, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I work as a psychological astrologer, and so really my work focuses a lot more on counseling than prediction is more of my approach to astrology. And so I'm coming at it from an archetypal perspective and looking at patterns. I do a lot of work with families and finding the patterns that show up in our families and how we can that helps us understand ourselves as well as our interpersonal dynamics.
Well, this is ideal, because this entire program, for those listeners, just to remind you, is really about intentional meaningfulness, about the archetype. And so it's not necessarily, we don't predict, although we do talk at certain programs about the actual charts on hand. But is there a sound? I'm hearing a sound. Is that from my end?
I think it'll stop. It's on my, I think it just stopped. It was on my end.
Oh, that's all right.
Sorry.
Because that's all right. It was like a little music in the background. It's very good. And patterns, because the relationship is really a dynamic of Libra, and the family is totally centered about relationships. So I love the fact that you would return from, and I'm saying this also for our listeners, so we're having a little preview here because the format's a little different. Usually I do some intro beforehand, but we're kind of diving into this. Because before we spoke about the child and the mother with cancer, but here it's the whole family, the whole kit and caboodle, and that I'm thinking of. Not that family is seventh house, but the family's a beautiful place where we have relationships with the other person, which is Libra.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's ways of working, that I look at, when you compare a child's chart to the chart of the parents, right? How does that child change the relationship? So that can be part of how that comes in. And I think, right now with Venus having just gone retrograde,
Today,
barely
that's so
24
true.
hours ago. Yeah. That, there's a lot. It's a really intense time right now. There's a lot that's up for a lot of people. And I do think that there's elements of that this retrograde will impact families and partnership, because it's currently in Scorpio. It went retrograde at 10 degrees Scorpio, but it goes back into Libra with this retrograde cycle.
Yes. If I may stop here for a moment, and I really appreciate, Laura, this dialogue that we're just sort of jumping into, because, again, for the audience that are listening, this is the focus collectively, is Venus retrograde, which I'm about to explain a little bit about for those people that aren't familiar with what Venus retrograde is, and also in the dynamics of how powerful this is with our interrelationships with family, which is the other person of Libra. Because Venus retrograde, from Earth, the view of Venus it appears to go backwards, and it's a cycle that happens every 2 years with Venus on schedule pretty well. I mean, it's a pretty well clocked.
It's about every 18, 19 months is her
year and a half.
retrograde
I'm thinking
cycle.
of Mars. That's so true.
Yeah.
And we just finished a retrograde. And retrogrades are really that. So if I'm talking not just directly to you, but more to the audience there, that retrogrades really are a time where we revise, we think, we appraise things. So the fact that Venus rules Libra makes it so powerful. And the fact that it is in Scorpio, such as Laura has just mentioned, is another relationship that makes that commitment, that really ties in our resources, our exchange for creating a life force with somebody else.
Yeah, well, because Scorpio is tied to the 8th house in astrology, and the 8th house is shared resources, right? It's part of those houses that are partnership related, even though we don't necessarily view Scorpio as a partnership-oriented sign. It is in many ways because it's linked to how we connect with other people and the depth of that connection in different ways.
Yeah, and then added factor as we start to collect our intensity, because it's interesting, as it really, and Scorpio is an intense sign of emotion. It's a water sign. It's a fixed water sign like ice. Or that idea is that, I just flipped out my whole gear here. The Venus start point, which is another whole element of the Venus pattern, that over a course of 8 years, it connects with the sun 5 times in its orbit, making a pentagram, which happens to be in a certain sign for 100 years. It continues this repetition. And Scorpio is one of them, and I believe it's 25, 26 times that it connects, and we are at the second to the last one. So this is really potent, and then it's going to go to, well, I won't say at the moment because I don't want to give the wrong information, but it does add to this. The intensity, it's been since 1926, I believe. Maybe there might be 2 more. I could be an error in that. And a wonderful resource is Ariel Gutman's book on Venus.
Yeah,
I have that.
I think there's a lot with Venus. I mean, I think, and within that pentagram, right, it repeats over multiple years, and it draws a rose.
Yes.
In the sky. And so, of course, it's Venus. She's the goddess of love. What else would she be drawing in the heavens? But, I mean, because even at first, it's actually more of a heart, right? The first one retrograde cycle, and then the 18 months till the next retrograde is a heart. And it becomes these overlapping hearts, like those. I remember as a kid, you had those sort of shapes where you could trace circles on top of circles or shapes, and you basically are drawing a mandala. And so it's these heart shapes that overlap on each other in incrementally further apart, and ultimately it draws a rose. And how the perfection of that, right? That we would assign this planet that we see as Venus and all that she represents, and then all the imagery that we associate with love is tied to the planet's orbit.
And so important, because it is, besides the sun and the moon, which are often called the luminaries, it is the brightest planet in the sky and seen all over the world with all the mythologies, and connoting that love. So people need that connection to make meaningfulness in their lives. And in Scorpio, really wants to get to the truth of a fact. And I believe well, it's not just my belief, but the whole factor of it being in retrograde, in families, we'll segue back to that, the dynamics in families. There's many, well, it can be harsh. There can be death, and I say that, and I'm not trying to scare people like, oh my gosh, we're going to die. I have been aware of a few close people who's had some trauma with death. But for most of this, for the large majority of people, because I know many, many people, and there's just a few, and of course it's heart-wrenching that their experience is dealing with this, which life does present. But for most of us, it's a matter of ending a chapter and beginning a new, or going over an old chapter.
Yeah, well, retrogrades, I tell clients, whenever a planet is retrograde, I just put the prefix re, R-E, in front of whatever the archetype of the planet is, right? So with Mercury, we rethink. With Venus, we reevaluate. Venus is what we love and value. And so we revalue. We value again, we reassess what is important to us. And then it becomes, more specific based on the sign that she's in over the course of the cycle. And then individually, where she's falling within our own charts and how our charts, our personal astrology is being impacted by it will color the degree to which we feel how intensely we experience it. I'm very aware of this retrograde. She went retrograde on my North Node, trining my Sun. I'm very aware of this retrograde.
Oh my. Now, for people otherwise, yes, a North Node is a point, and it is, I'm just being the little aside person here, and the North Node is that point of our karmatic destination that we want to integrate, that we come into this world with one set of values and the exact 180-degree opposite, which is, in this case, must be
for me, Scorpio? It's 10-degree Scorpio.
Yeah, so you came with life force, a lot of life force and survival ability, and you are going towards connecting with a deep relationship to have exchange, or also it's the mysteries of life, digging down into why the mysteries and the changes of life and death, why the spirit continues to present life. If I'm saying that well.
I think there's an element of that. So that's where, for each of us, it can be the retrograde becomes really specific to, there is the collective. Clearly, in this country anyway, we are in a heightened Venusian Venus in Scorpio retrograde moment in history. There is, at a massive scale, we are examining what we value.
The feminine.
And Scorpio, the feminine, and Scorpio is about power and the misuse of power, the misuse of power, the misattribution of power, feeling powerless.
Betrayal.
It is betrayal, it's sexuality, all of that is scorpionic. And developing ultimately healthy relationships with power.
Which gets us back.
Power is actually a neutral thing. It's not good or bad. It can be misused, but it doesn't have
Laura.
that.
That's very true.
And so we are being given an opportunity to discover a new relationship with power, and how that is, I sort of think of it in some ways maybe like we're at a Juno O'Hara like moment where, she was Zeus's wife or Jupiter's wife, depending if you're Greek or Roman pantheon. And she gets branded as being jealous and the jealous, angry wife, but it's because she was promised co-rulership with her husband and he reneged. And so she was furious because she was promised power that he took away from her.
And they're definitely joined. There's never a mythology where they do divorce. It's true.
And so we are in this time of reevaluating power. And then when she gets back into Libra, it will be about equality, ideally, power, and then the balance of that, right? And this, often when I teach about Venus, I use the story of Dame Ragnall from the Arthurian legend, and that it's a very much Venus in Libra story, and about what women really want is what the story is about. And the answer is sovereignty. That is the answer of what women really want. And it's very much...
Yes, sovereignty, that's a very intriguing word. I want to go back to power, because power really is like the energy voltage when you plug in your machine. It works. If one has the power to operate, it's not... I mean, I like your thought, and I'm going back to the thought of neutrality, because so often power seems to be distorted into subjecting over another energy source, and I think the real factor here is whether a power works. So when you have a Scorpio, because Venus, relating back to Venus and Libra, which is the balance, ultimately, is that rather to say the goal of balance, of equal energies, so that when you get to Scorpio, it really has a full system to exchange with another person. And that means that both people are empowered with power, which I think goes to your sense of what you were saying with power, which I wanted to jump in on. So going to families, because this is intense, and I can relate. I too, during this period, we sold a house that we'd bought in California, in the same city that my father had lived in, because my husband and I took care of my father for 3.5 years during his last years of life, and then stayed there. It was a long experience and a very deep one, and of course, my father, and it was a good time to get. Many factors were very beneficial to me as a human. The fact is, that was 11 years ago. We finally sold this house. So it really finished up a whole epoch, you might say, of a chapter that I'd been prepared to do, but it still was the clang of the bell, And that's, I think in many ways, people are feeling this with their family relationships in some ways. Because that's where we start with, is our sisters or brothers or aunts or grandmothers or brothers, everybody.
Sure. I mean, our relationships as adults are either mirrors of or reactions to the people that we were raised with, right? That there's psychological imprinting that happens. And so we find ourselves in patterns that show up. It shows up astrologically, where you get patterns in relationships, patterns in families of astrology, of having the same sun sign, the same moon sign, the same nodes, going back generations. You end up with these patterns. You would have potentially patterns of retrograde planets could show up as well. And so then there's a family story, a family karma. If you had a family with a pattern of Venus retrograde, then there's a family story, there's a family narrative around always reevaluating what's important to you, and potentially a lack of consistency around values. And then that can be for somebody who does not have Venus retrograde natally, who's born into that dynamic. That can be very unsettling because they want the consistency. They don't have that embedded comfortability with impermanence in the same way. And so that could create a whole, host of complications potentially.
Definitely. And there's always going to be in a family unit, and we can extend it, this is again, aunts, uncles, your children, other people in the family, married people that come in, the dynamics of the in-laws or outlaws, as my stepdad calls it. I love that.
Sure, but I do think that the patterns tend to hold true, right? Whether it's adopted children, stepchildren.
Yes. No, I'm agreeing with you. And then what I'm thinking, you're right, because there is that universe that wants to support us as we need, not necessarily as we might consider, and have the conflicts or the compatibility as it is. I mean, most families have somewhere in the family where there's great compatibility, or else there's people that have more challenging personality factors. And those factors can be because we haven't recognized them in ourselves. And like in the Libra fashion, we reflect, we learn through these relationships. That's getting back to Libra there.
Sure, often, you absolutely see that mirroring or that flip. It's very common to see flip nodes between parents and children, right? So they're what the other needs to learn are flipped houses, right? So they have one has an Aries ascendant, the other has a Libra ascendant. That there's these mirroring that happens as patterns in families, because with all relationships, when I'm working with couples, ultimately, if you don't see some sort of challenging astrology in in this industry, when you're comparing two charts, the relationship doesn't tend to have many legs. It doesn't tend to go the distance, because in a romantic relationship, some of that tension is where the sexual tension is. So you need that to be there. But in family dynamics, ultimately the people in our lives, part of why they're in our life is to help facilitate opportunities for us to grow and evolve as souls. And if we're not challenged, there's no growth happening.
Well, I think that's exactly stating how astrology can be so helpful, because there's many, many stories where people can invent a lot of other less profitable or productive is the word, methods of thinking, because they don't get along with somebody. They start coming up with many projections that they're not realizing for their own growth, that they need to be aware. So having astrology demonstrate the energetic exchanges or the tensions, the similarities, because it was really very helpful in this sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want, it to be the lion's share of your interaction with somebody to be difficult. That's not fun.
Well, that can happen. That can happen in a family.
It can happen in a family, but in a partnership, right? You don't want to, if you can, you'd rather not have that be the dynamic. But yes, sometimes you end up in families where it's just really hard. You're really not like the people you're related to, or the people that are in your family are very unhappy, unhealthy people. And so it's a toxic relationship.
Yes,
and that happens.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, you're right. Dysfunctional in some ways is not taking authority in their own life. Or perhaps they have a totally different relationship with spirit and matter, is how I often see it, is that some people are more productive in the material fashion as a physicality of life. They measure success in certain steps of accomplishments and achievements, and others are more of a creative energy, and their desire is maybe to become more individuated and discover their own path. and they don't have that role model necessarily in their family.
Sure.
Or it can be the opposite. You can have a very
Right.
standard person that wants just a simple, and then
Yeah.
have
Well,
that.
and I think there's a whole host of ways that can manifest. And looking at where Venus falls in the chart for somebody is often illuminating as to what's important to them. Second house, Venus, all of that can help us to clue into some of it. And some of it's cultural, some of it's environmental. Some of it is how much liberty did that individual have when they were growing up to really pursue what they were interested in, as opposed to what their family thought that they should be interested in, right? And so then as adults, how authentic are they living? And are they projecting values that are actually not authentically how they view the world, but it's what they've taken on because that's what they've been told they should value?
I'm going to just say one thing, and then we're going to have take a break with a phone number, which I will give. And so I have to say that that number is 425-373-5527. Uranus right now wants us to be authentic. So we have a lot to talk about. There was somebody that called last week, Katie, and when we hung up, your data went out. So if you want to call back, please do. You have Laura and myself eager to talk with you. And that number is 425-373-5527. Thank you. From Talk Cosmos, Sue and Laura.
While we take a break from this week's edition of Talk Cosmos, let's take a look at this cycle's archetype. We are currently in the Yang period of Libra, ruled dually by Venus. By leaving the lower hemisphere of the self, the energy of Libra enters the arena where the completed self meets the other than self to form a relationship based on partnership. As a cardinal air sign on the descendant angle, represented by the equinox of equal light, Libra's energy learns through comparison and relationships, with the intention to integrate duality and polarities.
Celebrate your star energy blessings. Schedule a natal astrology chart consultation with Talk Cosmos host Sue Rose Minahan. You'll learn to better understand what personally fuels your soul's seed direction. Sue focuses on your questions to connect you into your unique heart's desire and your true soul path's birth essence. Just $125 for an hour-and-a-half session about your life energies and significant current transits, including a recording and a copy of your chart. Schedule by emailing info@talkcosmos.com. That's info@talkcosmos.com.
Ciao and greetings to all you folks out there that have got enough curiosity to tune in to what's going on here. My name is Jeff Peters. I am the Lively Astrologer, and you're listening to Talk Cosmos on Alternative Talk 1150 AM, where we unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our consciousness.
Well, welcome back. Hi, Katie. And Katie, perhaps tonight wasn't a chance for you to call, but if you could, we'd be glad to talk to you. And that number once more for the others is 425-373-5527. And Laura Tad, Ph.D., psychological astrologer with the wonderful site Mystic Sky, and I will continue our talk about Libra, Venus retrograde in Scorpio, and family dynamics, our basis of, well, we'll find out. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Yeah. Yes, the last word you had said and was about authentic, that the family wants us to be authentic. And And we started off with how powerful this whole retrograde is, and going into some explanation, which we can pass now, about the fact that we're redoing our thinking. But Uranus in Taurus, which is square the nodes, which means that those points that we were talking about, with our karmic going where we're going to and where we're passing from, which is on a orbital process all the time. And right now in Leo and Aquarius is very centered as an entire collective energy, wanting us to just do what you said, get to our authentic feelings, our authentic values of life and self-worth and finances, of how we make our finances.
That, I think, that'll be a lot of what I think the Uranus and Taurus, phase will be, that we are in a little bit, and then we'll be in next year for a good 7 years. About Uranus is all about authenticity. It's all about and how comfortable or not we are in being authentic. And I think it does get pulled into this retrograde, in part because of Taurus's relationship to Scorpio, that they're opposing signs, but that Taurus, like Libra, is the governing signs of Venus, right? And so we have this additional Venusian theme of Taurus being another expression of Venus. And that it adds to the intensity of this retrograde. I think there's so many layers of why this is a powerful retrograde, right? So Venus went retrograde on Friday, which is the day of the week that she governs. Right? We even get the word Friday from Freya.
Oh, yes.
Freya's day. Freya was the Nordic equivalent of Venus. And it's Viernes in Spanish, Venus. Friday is Venus's day. And so she turned on her heels, on her own day. And linking with authenticity, that's part of this reviewing of the retrograde, is what are our real principles? And how do we express what do we value? What do we need to let go of? What things, what ideals, what possessions, what people have we been holding on to that don't serve us?
Exactly, and we're learning through other people too, because it is through Libra right now in this month, and I want to keep bringing that up, because it really is. Because otherwise we could be sitting by ourselves. But the fact is, just politically, when we look at everything that's been happening, there's been so much emphasis on female, and in contrast, because the Libra does want to compare, because it has a me and other, and so it's going to look at this versus that, and what does one lack in order to be whole, in order to make a full complementary package. And so in so many aspects, and we are relating more to the family. So I'm wondering, too, how families with there's many kinds of families. I mean, there's extended families that you get together with the holidays for some. There's the nucleus family that you're growing up with. There's the family that you create where, people marry or have children or not. Not everybody has children, but they may be aunts and et cetera. And so in learning these principles of, I think somehow it must be that we're having our relationships being reflected back to us. Somehow we're needing to really refigure where we stand. I wonder if brothers and sisters are doing. My brother died actually a year ago. Mm-hmm. But I do have stepbrothers, and interesting, we have been interacting, and it is a real. I don't know if I can express exactly anything new in that regard for myself, but I'm just thinking over it.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the Venus has only been retrograde about 26 hours. And she does retrograde back into Libra. So I think in the latter part of this cycle, which is about, she's retrograde for 40 days. So the last week or so of her retrograde cycle, she'll be in Libra in November. And that's, I think, when it will become even more of that Libran energy of, I think first we're having to examine what we value, and then it's going to shift more into how does that impact our partnerships, our relationships, whether it's family, whether it's a romantic partner, that when we change what we value, that will absolutely, we don't exist in vacuums, right? So if you don't like the color of the wall in your living room anymore and you paint that, well, that's going to alter the mood of everybody who's in the home and the whole family dynamic. There's a systemic way that we work as humans, is we don't, one person, in family systems theory and psychology, a lot of the approach is understanding that when one person in the family changes, the whole family changes. It's not whether there's, if somebody has had a lot of turmoil and they work through that turmoil, the next time the family interacts with that person, it will be different. It can't ever go back to the way that it was because that person is altered. It's like a recipe. If you're making a dish and you add a new ingredient, you can't go back to how it was before that ingredient was added.
Now we're talking. I really...
Go ahead.
think, yes, what you're saying here really is the healing process, clearing energies that is done on a very vague sense for most people. But this is so psychologically, when you bring this up, that it is documented, and it would bring in also the charts. I'm wondering if you looked at the composite and then looked at the transits, thinking back to what...
Sure. It's fascinating to look at the composite chart of parents and then how their child's chart aspects that. Because there is always very intense synastry or transits that the composite chart was under. Right? So, and to some people more intense than others or in different ways. I have seen repeatedly parents' composite charts and their child's Pluto is conjunct the composite ascendant. That couple is forever altered in how they are perceived because that kid's Pluto hits the ascendant.
Yes, which is for general talk to say that there's great emotional transformation.
Yeah, it's not just, it's at another level than just, it's pretty hard to become a parent for the first time and not be changed, right? But yes. It's for some, it is much more extreme. And it forever impacts the relationship. So for some people, becoming parents is more subtle in terms of, it's more individual in terms of how that impacts them. And for others, it's really dramatically impacting how they relate as a couple. And so you can see that again, it can be patterns that show up in, doing...
this idea of the composite, wouldn't it be fascinating if we could do the entire United States as one huge composite when you think about that? Because really it is a matter of going with the spirit and the matter, which again and again comes up through astrology so often. Mm-hmm. But here, because, and I'm saying that in the sense that our relationship with the energies of the planet, of that energetic connection, that that's also just the entire energetic cosmos, And here we are in the living form of that manifestation. So, in other words, spirit and the matter of ourselves. So, however we look at that, it is this combination that can get extended and extended, meaning the whole thought that as one person thinks transforms the group, such as what you were just saying, if they heal, and how they can.
Well, that's, one of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung is, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed.
That, in scientifically, too, again and again, that it's a known factor.
Yeah, I mean, he was a medical doctor, so he had the scientific understanding, but he was applying that, saying what happens with chemical compounds is as true as what happens in interpersonal dynamics. And
I have a question about it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have a family or a group, let's say there's a Christmas event or a Thanksgiving or a Hanukkah or I'm thinking of
reunion
the,
or some large gathering.
Exactly. So you know all the people that are attending, and there's somebody that's having a difficulty there with a person has a difficulty with a certain member, and for whatever reason it is, they have some conflict going on, which is they're wanting to work on. And if they go to an astrologer, if they come to you, would it even be possible to do the composite of those people, which is what I understood could be? Of course, we can do that. And then maybe do a composite without that person and compare. Do you think that would be helpful for?
Well, I think when you start doing composite charts with lots of people that make up the composite charts, like, well, yes, in theory, it's just math. So you could do a composite chart that included 500 people. I don't know how helpful that is. And there's some debate. I was
thinking more like 27 maybe at the biggest.
But there's some debate about, even in doing that, how some of it's calculated. So there's not an agreement on how you calculate houses with multiple charts in a composite chart. And so part of it is like technically it's complicated to do that, but absolutely you could look at it of, one of the things I've explored in trying to figure this out for myself even is, so let's say you have a family and there's it's a blended family. And so what is the dynamic with the stepchildren or and the half siblings and without the stepchildren and half siblings, right? Because they're both are actually family units.
Yes.
Right? And so what is the difference? You could examine that. I haven't done much of that because I have found there to be so much disagreement on actually how, when you get into 9 people that you're creating a composite chart for, the technical way in which it's calculated, there's debate about. So I haven't done too much work with it myself, because when I've tried to research it, I've run into that, and it comes out so vastly different based on how it's calculated that it felt like it just got too murky and confusing for me to try to approach it that way. So when I've done composite charts with family members, I'm really looking at the parents, so just 2 people in the composite chart, and then the synastry of the other people to that composite chart.
That in itself gives a lot of information. It's true, because if you, I see.
Yeah, how does that individual, I gave it when I spoke at UAC, I even gave an example of a client who is a stepmom, but she didn't meet her stepchildren, her stepsons, for a year. into the relationship, because that's sort of the guiding principle right now, the sort of rule of thumb that a lot of psychologists talk about with people who have children from a previous relationship, is to not introduce them to their new partner for a year, so that it's really an established relationship and there's not a revolving door of people in children's lives.
Yeah.
And so, she didn't meet her stepsons for a year. And as soon as she did, all of a sudden their charts were aspecting the composite chart with her partner in a really direct way, where it had been more indirect. Yes, they existed, but they existed before the partnership did, right? They're her stepkids. They're from his marriage that's been over for 15 years. So the child predates the existence of the composite chart in many ways. And yet, as soon as they came in to their daily life, well, you get these aspects that create some friction in the relationship that didn't exist prior to the boys being part of the relationship. And so it even though the timing is flipped.
Yes, what I'm thinking too, the whole prospect of astrology relates to time, and essentially, because every birth reflects that moment that the parents experience at that, like a living energy of that moment on. So it would, there's many dynamics. It's so true. I'm thinking of, we don't have too many minutes here to finish. And I hope that this has spurred people's thoughts about their own families. There's such a learning prospect with relationships and how we carry that through and trying to heal those relationships in the sense of understanding them and how they relate to ourselves, and that they may not just be that other, quote, rotten person, or else or why one is so supportive, find out how. But Venus itself, and you had brought up that it can be, which I agree totally, and also Venus, because Venus is both the morning star and the evening star, which also of its orbit, and it goes invisible for, I think, 7 months. I think it is. There's a good author besides Ariel Guterman who writes about the star. Adam Gainsbourg, The Light Venus, talks greatly about Venus.
He's done a lot with the synodic cycles of Venus. He's got a lot on that.
Rises and lowers, and like I'm an evening star, which has a different. And so people could be an evening star, a morning star, which also gives a dynamic as far as their energy goes in the family. The morning might be more industrious or more of a conquering type, and the Venus might be more of a reflective type.
Yeah, in some ways, and I sort of equate that a little bit to morning star being more Taurian and evening star being more Libran, in terms of her two, that she governs two signs, right? And that's a little, it's not quite accurate, but it feels close to me.
I think that has an intriguing sense, because the Taurian has more stability, stability, but also survival, wanting the growth of life. And the Libra is now really negotiating between me and you, the people, the other person, always trying to negotiate a cooperative balance, not really thinking of anything just by themselves. Whereas Taurus is totally about my survival. How am I going to continue?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of how I've sort of seen the difference of morning star, evening star, is that Taurian Libran archetype, or even, again, like I'm saying, some of the myths I've used, I sort of, the Snow White, story of Snow White, is a more Taurian Venus in a lot of ways, right? It has a lot to do with jealousy, a lot to do with values, a lot to do with beauty, which, right? Taurus, beauty, or sensory experience.
Beauty. And that gets back to that pentagram. And besides the fact that 5 and 8, which we didn't even discuss really at this point, but the Fibonacci numbers, and that astrology, the horoscope, can actually be looked at from a mathematical viewpoint. Russ von Ohlhausen, who's at this conference here at iAstrologer with Organization of Professional Astrology right now, is a big proponent of that, and David Cochran and quite a few, which is the same as pi. It's the perfect ratio, the means. Leonardo, beauty. I know I'm throwing a bunch out there at the last minute. And I had a question I was going to ask you, which we have 2 minutes for, if I can just recall, about Venus. And so I'll let that go.
Morning star, evening star. I mean, she's also, she can be combust. So when she's rising and setting so close to the sun that she's actually invisible, right? That's when she's in that underworld phase.
And many stages of it. Like, for instance, in my family, I was with, I think it is with this book with Adam, that you can be in a conception, like inception, at the very beginning, underground. And you can be the morning, then you can go back underground, and you can be one at the very end. And my mother is an inception, and my father was the very end. Their marriage didn't last, and who knows for what reason. But I thought to myself, it's a relationship, and wouldn't that be an interesting factor to perhaps research more on the subtlety of Venus?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's where I think looking at the Venus phase could be a pattern that shows up in families. Does she show up as combust or Cassimi, or morning star, evening star repeatedly in family members, right? So when you look at family dynamics with astrology, I think there's a million ways you could approach it to look for patterns. And Venus is absolutely one of them in terms of sign, in terms of house, in terms of aspects, in terms of morning star or evening star. And you would see patterns, because what that's demonstrating is family karma, family stories, and how those bleed through generations, right? And you can go back, with certain things, certainly with looking at, morning star, evening star for Venus, so long as you had a birthday and the birth date, you could calculate that for as many generations of you as you have birth data for. You wouldn't need time or location to know if she was evening star or morning star. You just need to know if she was rising or setting before the sun, and see how that has bled through the generations. And was there a shift that happened at some point? Was there enough family work done with one archetypal expression that she transitioned?
Absolutely. For our public, this has been such a great talk, because it really gives a whole other emphasis to Libra, because there are 5 talks. There's going to be 2 more next week. Willie Bodrak, living in Mexico, living near Guadalajara, Lake Chapala. She's been there for 20 years and lives with her husband there. And she'll be joining us, and we'll be talking about Libra from that aspect within the community. There's many people that move out of the country, and they rely very much so upon one another in different relationships. So that'll be intriguing to do. And tonight we've been talking with Laura Cad, who's returned Ph.D. with Mythic Sky, who's an astrologer. You can find us and also myself at talkcosmos.com. And we have our guests continually there. Tonight's been very exciting, so I thank you very much. We have about 1 minute. Well, we don't have that, really. We do have to. Well, okay.
Well, it was great to be on again, Sue. Thank you. I'm sure there's lots of people we both know that are in Arizona, so please say hi to our mutual colleagues.
It's been marvelous. Organizational professional astrology, which you can join whether you're, for those that aren't here, professional or not, is so powerful, and it is true. And, well, we miss you, and it is a whole new set of relationships. And talking about new brain storms or new brain cell activity, it does reflect into the whole group of relationships. So, and I really liked your talk about, and I have about 30 seconds here, about the Venus with the composite for relationships. Thank you, Laura.
Yes, absolutely. It was fun.
All right. Again.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Be sure to tune in next Saturday at 6 p.m. to continue finding your roots in the stars.
The preceding audio was via a Skype call.